Okay, my name is Pilar Marrero, and I'm a journalist. And in the early 90s, I was working for La Opinión, which is the largest Spanish language newspaper in the US. And it was, at the time, a very large newspaper. And I was covering the Latino community, and in particular, I covered immigration and politics. So in the early 90s, that's what I was doing, covering the day-to-day of the Latino community and a lot of the immigration issue, because at the time it was one of our main issues for Spanish language media or Spanish language newspaper. Ethnic media, which is the term some experts use, has always existed in the United States. It comes with immigrants. With the presence of immigrants from different countries, you have their newspapers and eventually radio stations and television that tries to cater to that community. In the case of Spanish language media, La Opinión, where I worked, had existed, was basically founded after the Mexican Revolution, and a lot of Mexicans came to the United States. And so it was born in 1927, I believe. But by the late 1980s and early 1990s, the United States had seen a very large influx of Latin American immigrants due to several reasons. One of the reasons was a new immigration law that started in 1965, which changed the way immigration happened. And another reason was the fact that Latin America, specifically Mexico and Central America, were having a lot of crisis, economic crisis, political crisis, wars, and that displaced a lot of people. Spanish language media, newspapers like La Opinión, at the time there was the beginning of what later was Univision, and later on came Telemundo and other networks, started catering to that immigrant community, to the Spanish speaker. And the role that we had was not only to provide the news, but be a resource for people to learn how to live in the new country that they were in. In a way, it was kind of a educational role where they could learn how this country worked, how the political system worked, how the educational system worked, et cetera, et cetera. So that was my sense of what I was doing as a journalist, and me and my colleagues in La Opinión were not just catering to an exile community or an immigrant community, but also helping them integrate into this society. So that's how we felt about the work that we did at the time. Well, there's always been this issue where if you have a media that have a different language, people question it somehow. It becomes suspect for some. In terms of La Opinión and other Spanish language media in the early 90s, when things started getting a little tense and there were some race issues, and there were, particularly in LA where La Opinión was and it still is, we had riots. We had the Rodney King incident, the police brutality incident that became a worldwide news, and it turned into a trial that then became riots. And those riots really showed the racial divisions in the city and the economic and social divisions in the city. In the midst of all this, the Latino community was growing and had grown all through the 80s. And the early 90s, you could say that growth was already kind of calmed down. The migration wasn't as heavy as it was during the 80s, but you could see now the change that LA and other places was going through in general, in California, Southern California in particular, but also other parts of the state. And that presence, that change, that, the signs in Spanish and, the television and the fact that you had newspaper in Spanish, some people were uncomfortable with that. Part of the reason 187 came about was because there were some people in Orange County, which was a traditionally conservative white area of California, that started seeing all this Spanish being spoken, and there's an anecdote about this woman called Barbara Coe, who is one of the founders of a group that ended up creating Proposition 187. She was just a resident, just a lady from Orange County who, as she told the story, one day she came in a social service office, right? I don't know which office in particular, but she came into one of these offices and she saw a lot of people speaking different languages. And she saw a number of people just attending or tending to these people in different languages, like in Spanish and Vietnamese. And she didn't see that many Americans being helped. So their conclusion she got was that Americans were not getting help because all these immigrants who spoke other languages were being helped. And this is what she would tell when people would ask her why she came together with other people in Orange County to create this anti-immigrant group. So you can imagine how, that resonated with other people who were uncomfortable about the demographic change in California. And then when you had the recession hit in the early 90s, then for them it was pretty clear that the recession had to do with immigrants. And, the rest is history. We know that immigration is a political issue, it's a hot potato, and it's been used all through the history of the United States to kind of benefit certain politicians that use it as a tool to get elected. And this is what happened in 1994. A very curious thing about one of the moments when this group came together, this group with this lady, Barbara Coe, this other man called Bill King, who was a former Immigration and Naturalization Service agent. At the time, that was the name of what today is known as ICE. It was INS, Immigration and Naturalization Service. There was this man called Harold Ezell, who had been regional manager of INS here in Southern California, and this other man called Alan Nelson, who was the commissioner of the INS also in the 80s, and a few other people. There were some political consultants, et cetera, that later joined the group. But at the beginning, it was just this small group. Oh, and a guy called Ron Prince, who had a very interesting story. And all of these people had their own story about why they felt immigrants were bad, and how they personally felt affected by immigrants. And Ron Prince was this guy who was just a businessman in, I think, in Tustin or somewhere in Orange County. And he told the story that he had a business with this Canadian, quote unquote, illegal immigrant who had defrauded him. And he would go around saying, these illegal immigrants, they go around defrauding you. It turned out the guy was not an illegal immigrant. He was a legal immigrant from Canada. He had some business with him, and it turned out that they split and they had some issues. But the guy took this personal story and turned it into this hate against immigrants. Same with Barbara Coe, who visited this social services office and heard all these languages, et cetera, and on and on and on. The other guys, the guys that came from the federal government, Alan Nelson and Harold Ezell, they were tied to an organization called FAIR, which still exists. It's called the Federation for American Immigration Reform. And they propose very radical anti-immigration ideas. And they have been around for several decades. And they have been tied to a man called John Tanton, who had documented racist ideas about, non-whites, and has been termed by some organizations like the Southern Poverty Law Center as a hate group. These guys were also into the mix. So there was a mixture of just regular citizens feeling weird about the diversity around them, and some people who came from the outside, who came from this group that had ulterior motives about promoting these ideas. So they decided they were going to have an initiative. And in California, you can just gather signatures and put a law on the ballot, and people will vote for it. This is something that doesn't exist in other states, but in California, it's one of the things that make California interesting. And so they started gathering signatures, and they weren't very successful initially. It seemed that they were not going to make it, but at the time, Pete Wilson, who was the governor, he was running for re-election, and he was not the most liked guy within the Republican Party because he had raised taxes, and he was also pro-choice. He was sort of a moderate Republican. And I think his approval rating inside the Republican Party was like, at some point, it was like 15%. And his approval rating in general, at that time of his campaign for re-election, was not very good. He wasn't going to make it. There was another candidate, Democrat Kathleen Brown, who was ahead. So the political consultants were desperate to find something that would help Pete Wilson be reelected. And when they caught wind of this initiative that was going around, they decided to pour money and resources into gathering the signatures, and then the rest, they were the ones that actually made 187 qualify for the ballot. So one of the interesting things about this group that started gathering in Orange County around their common, I don't know if I should call it hate, but it's probably what it is, or they felt uncomfortable with the demographic change, and they felt like immigrants were to blame for some things. They gathered, and this was documented in the media, and I remember being, doing research at the time and seeing this report and thinking it was very absurd because they gathered at a Mexican restaurant. These guys like Barbara Coe, Ron Prince, Bill King, Alan Nelson, Harold Ezel, the people that produced Proposition 187, the proposition that wanted to take away education and healthcare and social services and turn every social service person in California into an immigration agent. They gathered at a Mexican restaurant and eating Mexican food, which is, I think, the most ironic thing. One of the most ironic things in this story. And so, they ended up, forming this group called SOS, Save Our State. It was, SOS, the international symbol, or the international word for emergency, save us. And they actually wrote the proposition and gathered the signatures to put it on the ballot with the help of Pete Wilson and the Republican Party, which later gave them money to supplement what they couldn't do. The irony of this anecdote is that the group of people from Orange County, the activists that came together to write Proposition 187, gathered at a Mexican restaurant eating Mexican food. This proposition that would deny education and healthcare and social services to undocumented immigrants in California. This proposition that would turn every person that dealt with social services, every public servant in California that dealt with social services, even nurses and teachers, into immigration agents. These people went to a Mexican restaurant and gathered there to talk about what they were going to do to get rid of these people that were bothering him, that was bothering them, these people that they felt uncomfortable around, these languages that bothered their ears and that they didn't want around them in their suburbs and their cities. That was a very ironic anecdote, and that was widely reported at the time. I thought it was pretty interesting. Proposition 187, even though it was pushed by the Republican Party of California and the gubernatorial candidate, or the governor seeking re-election at the time, Pete Wilson, it was not unanimously supported by Republicans. on the one hand, some Republicans in other states, like George W. Bush, was governor of Texas at the time, he opposed it. Jeb Bush in Florida, he opposed it. And two national figures of the Republican Party who had been in the cabinets of Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush, George Bush the father, came out opposing it. And they said, first of all, this is not a conservative solution to the issue of immigration because this would turn public servants into Big Brother. This is not conservative. You know, conservatism is supposed to be against the intervention of the government in your life, right, in people's lives. It's supposed to want, government to be as small as possible and not really have a big role. Well, here were these Republicans in California trying to turn the California public servants into Big Brother, essentially. And they also said, this is kind of a match that's going to light and it's going to corrode the soul of the party. Everything's going to be about immigration from now on. This is not the solution to the issue. And they warned Pete Wilson and the Republican Party of California from using 187 as the political issue that they did. They used it in the re-election campaign of the governor. And they were right. That's exactly what happened. They came out and they were courageous in doing it. They were very criticized inside others in the party for it. And, they were protested against, they were called names, by some activists in the Republican Party. And the truth is that the Republican Party of California suffered the consequences in the long term because this is the proposition that pushed many Latinos to register to vote, pushed many to become naturalized citizens, and that eventually, only 2 years later, they lost the majority of the assembly, the legislature. The assembly is the lower house of the legislature of California. They lost the majority for the last time, and they've never regained it. And ever since that happened, the Republican Party has just gone down in California to the point that is a minority, even below what we have here. We have, you can register as a voter, as a decline to state voter, meaning you don't have a party, you don't choose a party. Well, not choosing a party has more voters than Republican parties in California. So it really hurt themselves. They really hurt themselves with this proposition. And in part, this is what Jack Kemp and William Bennett wanted to prevent, warn them about. This is not going to be good for the country. This is not going to be good for the Republican Party, and they were right. To really understand how the issue of immigration has changed over time, and in particular, how Republican politicians have addressed the issue differently in the past, you have to go into, the memory of this debate that happened, and it's on YouTube. You can look it up. It's a debate in 1980 between, this was a Republican primary between Ronald Reagan, and who was running for the Republican nomination, and George H.W. Bush, who was also running and later became his vice president. They had a debate on television, and they were asked about the issue of immigration and allowing services like education for undocumented immigrants, because at the time there was a law that was passed in Texas to charge people to send their kids to school if they didn't have papers, which became the big case, ended up going to the Supreme Court, Plyler versus Doe, and established the fact that, it doesn't matter if you're documented or not, you have a right to public basic education. The reactions and the responses from Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush was very telling, because they were both critical of the idea of keeping undocumented immigrants from being educated, and also criminalizing the work of undocumented immigrants. Ronald Reagan was very opposed to the idea that people would live in the shadows and that they could be abused by employers. And he also was opposed to the idea that we should close our doors to people who were entrepreneurial and who wanted to come here to work. I mean, at the time, yes, Ronald Reagan was a very conservative man, and he was pushing all this. He was very concerned about Cuba, so about Cuba and communism spreading into Latin America, and he was sending all this money to fight guerrillas all over Central America, and they were pushing coups in South America, and all that happened. At the same time, Reagan was opposed to keeping immigrants from education, keeping immigrants from being able to work in the United States. He wanted to make these immigrants legal. George H.W. Bush also said during that debate, look, these are good people. Some of my family is Mexican. As you know, his son Jeb is married to a Mexican. So he understood that this was a vilification that went beyond just being undocumented or not. And they both came out against this idea, which, if you kind of move forward to the 90s and even to today, is not at all what the Republican Party has turned out to be in the long run. Coverage of this issue in the Spanish language media was very intense. It was, there were at least 4 or 5 reporters. La Opinión had 10 reporters at the time, which was a lot for us. And we had at least 5 or 6 of them covering immigration every day during this period. And there was a lot of discussion about the consequences, what the consequences would be of denying education, denying health care to undocumented immigrants. Many of these families were not just undocumented, they were mixed. There were kids who were undocumented, there were kids who were citizens, and there were family members who were residents, et cetera, et cetera. So this was going to affect not just undocumented immigrants, but their family members who were not undocumented. And the fear of being separated, the fear of having, a nurse or a teacher report you because you appear to be undocumented was widely discussed in Spanish language media every day. It was a big topic. At the time, English language media, and in particular, for example, the local newspaper, the LA Times, they covered the issue, but they didn't have that many Latinos in the newsroom. And believe it or not, that makes a difference in how you cover an issue. If you don't have the diversity, if you don't have the point of view of someone who lives in that community and who actually can go into that community and report what's going on there, and if you don't have the Spanish speakers that can put their ear to the ground and hear what people are talking about, in the market or in the streets or in the pages of La Opinión or in Univision or, radio stations at the time, KWKW or one of those, you would not know what was going on. I had the feeling that the coverage in the mainstream media was a lot about us versus them. It was like immigration was covered from the outside. And I remember, I don't know if it was in this time or maybe a little bit later, when there were some other anti-immigrant laws being passed in Congress, that Time magazine had a big front page article about illegal immigration, quote unquote. And they had, the image of some immigrant worker, and then they had like a centerpiece story about the issue of illegal immigration, as they call it. And I read through the story. It was probably 2,000 words or more, 3,000 words. I didn't see any undocumented immigrant being interviewed, not one. I remember writing a column about it and saying, okay, if you're gonna write about this community and you're gonna have all these outsiders and all these experts and all these politicians talking, but you're not gonna go into the community and talk to them, How is this a representative piece of journalism? So this was happening in the mainstream media a lot at the time. And this is why I think many times when you had people react and you had people march out and, the walkouts in schools and high schools, and, the big marches that happened later, even in the mid-2000s, right? We had like the big marches, the big march against 187, and then you had other big marches, bigger marches in the 2005, 2006 period. People in the mainstream were surprised when this happened because the mainstream media did not have their ear to the ground, and they were not understanding how these issues were affecting the community. So only 2 years after the passage of Proposition 187, there was a very bad election for Republicans in California. It was in 1996, November. And in 94, they had won big, right? They had won the governor's race, and they had won the Congress with Newt Gingrich. This was during the Clinton administration, the first Clinton administration. In 96, a lot of new voters came out, and many Latinos, many more Latinos voted in that election. And the Republicans lost the majority of the state assembly, and it was pretty clear that this new voter was very much taking a stance against what had happened 2 years before. Political scientists were talking about it. People were talking about it in the hallways, of the party, and all of this. And Pete Wilson started getting criticized by people saying, hey, maybe this was not such a good idea. Maybe this will be bad for the Republican Party. Maybe this loss that we have in 96 had to do with the fact that 2 years ago you did this. So there was a press conference on the day after the election. And I showed up, to cover the press conference from, by La Opinión, et cetera. And he started talking about what happened. And so I raised my hand and I said, Governor, don't you think, that the fact that you pushed this initiative 2 years ago and this anti-immigrant initiative has anything to do with the fact that now you've lost all these seats in the legislature and that the Republican Party got hit hard by the voters in the election yesterday? And he got really upset. He started pointing and saying, the reason people think I'm anti-immigrant is because they have been deceived by the media, especially certain media, that I am anti-immigrant. I'm not anti-immigrant. I am anti-illegal immigration. I'm not against legal immigration, and on and on. And he was convinced that voters, Latino voters, were deceived by the media into thinking that he was anti-immigrant. It wasn't his proposition. It wasn't his "they keep coming" ad. It was the media, the Latino media and the Spanish language media in particular, that was to blame. I actually came out of that press conference very happy that, it's like, okay, well, maybe we did our job. We told our community what this initiative is about. And it's not about fixing a problem. It's about scapegoating a community. One of the problems that people who wanted to sign up immigrants, particularly Mexican immigrants, which were the majority of Latinos, to naturalize, was that people weren't very excited about naturalization, in part because people thought they were going to return to Mexico eventually, and they were also not able to keep both citizenship. So they could not keep Mexican citizenship. They would lose it if they became a citizen of the United States. So there was an effort made to bring this message to the people, to the government in Mexico, and to the candidates from Mexico who were actually crossing the border and coming north to there was no way to vote from overseas, but these immigrants had a lot of influence in their families in Mexico because they would send a lot of money and they would be tied to their families, so they could influence their vote in Mexico. So these candidates started to cross the border and come here to to proselytize and to campaign. And activists from here started approaching these candidates and say, look, if you really want Mexicans to have more of a voice, a political voice in the United States, you need to have you need to pass a law to have double citizenship, and to, and then came also a fight to have people vote. You could vote from overseas, which, it was a long fight as well. And so this was one of the things that made more people eventually decide to naturalize, because before they felt they were going to lose not just their future in their country, but their ability to just go back to their country, to own property. At the time, you couldn't own property if you were a foreigner in Mexico. So there were all these complications, and just people, even if they lived here for 20 years, they wouldn't naturalize. They would be Mexican. I met people, that naturalized after 30, 40 years of living here. They had these old green cards that, at the time you didn't have to renew them every 10 years. You could, you got a green card and until it disappeared, until it fell apart, you could keep your green card. They were very old green cards, and they were a resident for 30, 40 years without even thinking about becoming a citizen of the United States. So, but many of us who saw the anti-immigrant laws and things they were doing in the mid-90s felt, and I personally was one of them. I was a legal resident in 94. I wasn't a citizen yet. And I felt like I had to become a citizen as soon as I could, not just because I wanted to participate in the political system, but also because I felt it was a threat to be just a simple resident. You could be deported for, committing not too bad a crime. You could, for example, get, a DUI or something like that and get deported, because that was the 1996 law. And so I became a citizen in the year 2000, feeling that not only I should participate and vote, but also I should protect myself and beware of not having enough legal protections, because things were changing fast in the law, and I didn't want to be caught up in that. And I know a lot of people who became a citizen for that reason. I would start by saying that 187 was the first stone. You cast the first stone. And yes, it went down to defeat in the courts in California, but it became an issue like Jack Kemp and William Bennett, the Republicans, that warned their own party about corroding the soul of the party and generating copycats all through the country. That's what happened. After 187 passed and then was turned down and rejected by the courts, you had an effort to pass a federal law in 1996, two federal laws actually. One was welfare reform and the other was an immigration reform law. The welfare reform included language that differentiated between legal residents and citizens, and restricted what kinds of services and public services, essentially, legal residents could get as opposed to citizens. This was the first time this difference was made. So here we have the beginnings of the criminalization of the legal resident. Not yet. We're not even talking about the undocumented. And then we had the other law called IRA, which changed immigration law radically and restricted, made it very complicated to legalize yourself and restricted the avenues that you had to do it. And over the years, the implementation of this 1996 law that was signed by Bill Clinton has been one of the reasons why it's become so draconian a task to legalize yourself in this country. And in a way, it has kept this undocumented population trapped without being able to, like previous generations of immigrants, being able to legalize and regularize their status and become citizens and integrate fully into the society, et cetera, et cetera. So this spread like wildfire, and over the years you had other copycats. You had a number of state laws that happened. You had a number of local ordinances that happened in cities and counties. This went on all through the new century, you know, the beginning, the 2000s, and it became even more difficult after 9/11 because then there was a focus on immigration and immigrants as a threat, even though the people that committed the terrorist acts were not undocumented immigrants. They were people who had visas and came to this country from Saudi Arabia and had nothing to do with the Mexican population that crossed the border or the Central Americans. Those issues also came into the mix. Essentially, for the last 25 years, we've been living in anti-immigrant era in the United States. And I think the crown achievement of this anti-immigrant era is the presidency of Donald J. Trump.